I was at a small dinner party last weekend when the conversation inevitably turned to cinema. There was this guy there, let's call him Julian, who leaned back in his chair, adjusted his glasses, and declared with total conviction that his favorite film of all time was Bela Carr's Tango. He spent 10 minutes dissecting the exquisite misery of his 7-hour runtime, looking every bit the sophisticated intellectual. The rest of the guests nodded along, clearly impressed by his rigorous, almost ascetic taste. But about an hour later, I happened to glance at his phone while he was scrolling for a photo. His YouTube recently watched sidebar was a solid wall of Fast and Furious highlights and Best of Mean Girls compilations. The exquisite misery of Hungarian art house cinema was nowhere to be found. In that brief moment, Julian's expression shifted from that of a highbrow critic to the slight flickering panic of someone who had been caught in a very specific kind of performance. It made me realize that when we talk about our favorites, we are rarely telling the truth. We're usually signaling. We have the social favorites. We wear like a designer coat to tell the world we are intelligent, cultured, and deep. Then we have the comfort favorites, the movies we actually watch on a rainy Tuesday night, because they offer the emotional equivalent of a warm blanket. But there is a third category, one that is even more revealing. It's the sacred favorite, the movie or song that resonates so intensely with your actual soul that you almost can't bear to experience it. It's the one that makes you take off the mask and see who you really are, which is exactly why you avoid it. If I asked you right now what your favorite movie is, you'd probably give me a respectable, correct answer. But if I looked at your search history or the song you play when you're entirely alone, we'd find a very different story. You're lying about your favorite movie, and I think I know why.
Julian's YouTube sidebar isn't just like some embarrassing contradiction to laugh off. It is actually a textbook example of utilizing media for deep, necessary emotional regulation.
Right.
That stark contrast between the intellectual rigor he projects to the room and the highly stimulating, easily digestible media he actually consumes in private that introduces the first major pillar of our media consumption architecture, the comfort favorite.
Okay, so to understand exactly what Julian is doing, or what you were doing when you put on that familiar sitcom for the 100th time, we really have to look at the psychological foundation of comfort consumption, right?
Exactly. And it all begins with a mechanism known as a self-discrepancy.
A self-discrepancy. I'm assuming that means a gap between who you are and who you want to be.
It's a painful incongruity between how one currently perceives oneself, which is the actual self, and how one desires to view oneself, the ideal self. This gap is actually a primary driver of compensatory consumer behavior.
Compensatory consumer behavior, meaning we buy things or consume media to make up for that gap.
Yes. The human psyche constantly attempts to maintain stable levels of psychological assets. We need self-esteem, a sense of belongingness, feelings of power, and a sense of control over our environment just to function normally.
Right.
So when an event occurs in your day that threatens those assets, a self-discrepancy is triggered.
So if you bomb a presentation at work or you fail an important test, that triggers a discrepancy regarding your intelligence or your competence. You suddenly feel like you aren't the smart, capable person you tell yourself you are.
Or consider social exclusion. You find out your friends gathered without you. That creates a massive gap between your actual and desired level of social belonging.
Yeah.
Or you experience a sudden loss of power or status in your professional life. That leads to a discrepancy between your realized position and your desired ambition. Regardless of the specific domain, whether it is intelligence, social standing, or power, the critical factor is that self-discrepancies are psychologically aversive.
They don't just make you feel a little down.
No, they cause genuine, measurable distress.
And when you say measurable distress, I mean, we aren't just talking about abstract sadness here. The reality of this distress has a literal physiological component. There's this fascinating study regarding the biological reality of this psychological pain.
Oh, the acetaminophen study.
Researchers took individuals who were experiencing acute, meaning-based self-discrepancies, people going through real identity crises or severe social rejection, and they administered acetaminophen, just standard over-the-counter physical painkillers.
The results of that intervention completely redefine how we understand emotional pain. The administration of that physical pain medication successfully reduced their subsequent need to engage in compensatory behaviors.
Tylenol essentially blunted their psychological crisis. That is wild to me.
Incredible.
A physical painkiller fixed an identity crisis. That proves that the psychological gap of a self-discrepancy isn't just in your head, in a metaphorical sense.
Yeah.
It registers within the human body as literal biological pain.
Does. The neural circuitry that processes a physical injury like burning your hand on a stove or breaking a bone overlaps significantly with the neural circuitry that processes social and psychological.
Wow.
The brain interprets a threat to the ego or a loss of social standing as a severe injury that requires immediate triage. And because the pain is intensely real, the motivation to alleviate it is overwhelming. When faced with a self-discrepancy, humans immediately deploy coping strategies to mitigate the discomfort.
So what do those coping strategies look like in practice? How do we actually put out that fire in the brain?
Well, the compensatory consumer behavior model outlines 5 distinct strategies used to cope with these self-discrepancies. The first is direct resolution. This involves actively trying to fix the exact source of the discrepancy. If you fail a test, direct resolution means staying up all night, studying harder for the next one. You directly attack the problem.
Right, which sounds like the healthiest option, but also the most exhausting one.
The second is symbolic self-completion. This involves acquiring items or symbols that signal mastery in the threatened domain.
So if your intellect is threatened, you might go out and buy an imposing stack of classic literature, placing it prominently on your desk to signal to yourself and others that you are, in fact, intellectual.
The third strategy is dissociation. This is the active avoidance of products or media associated with an undesired identity. You basically distance yourself from anything that reminds you of the failure. The fourth is fluid compensation. This involves affirming your identity in a completely different, unthreatened domain. If you suffer a terrible professional failure, you might suddenly pour all your energy into cooking a complex 5-course meal for your family.
You compensate for the professional lack of control by demonstrating absolute mastery in a culinary domain.
Which leaves the fifth strategy, and this brings us right back to Julian and his YouTube history.
Escapism.
Yes. The fifth strategy is escapism. This is the exact mechanism driving the consumption of the comfort favorite. Escapism involves deliberately directing one's thoughts away from a self-discrepancy by narrowing attention elsewhere.
So watching a compilation of fast and furious cars exploding does not resolve Julian's underlying insecurities about his intellect or his social standing.
It does not provide direct resolution, and it certainly isn't symbolic self-completion.
Instead, it deliberately narrows his attention to highly engaging hedonic stimuli, the loud noises, the fast cars, the predictable narrative beats.
Exactly.
This cognitive distraction reduces the immediate salience of the discrepancy. It is a psychological retreat from the exhausting, unrelenting performance of maintaining his ideal self at that dinner party.
Escapism operates fundamentally by lowering the cognitive load required for self-awareness. When you feel you have fallen short of societal standards or your own internal benchmarks, the resulting self-focus becomes cognitively taxing.
Because you are constantly monitoring your behavior, your posture, your vocabulary. It is emotionally cumbersome.
Yes, and by fixating on simple, highly stimulating narratives or predictable, familiar media, you temporarily suppress that self-awareness. The discrepancy still exists in reality, but its importance and immediate psychological weight are momentarily lifted.
You know, the psychology of the comfort favorite directly parallels the psychology of comfort food. Both are utilized as rapid-acting, highly accessible tools for emotional regulation.
Absolutely.
But there is a critical paradox in how people understand their own coping mechanisms, especially when it comes to why they reach for these comforts.
Oh, the motivations driving the consumption of comfort food reveal a profound disconnect between conscious belief and behavioral reality.
Right.
When individuals are surveyed about why they consume comfort foods or comfort media, they articulate very specific expectations regarding the benefits of that consumption.
And these expectations are generally categorized into 5 distinct subscales, right?
Yes. Managing negative affect, alleviating boredom, enhancing cognitive competence, feeling the experience is pleasurable and rewarding, and generating positive feelings.
And if you ask anyone on the street why they are eating a massive bowl of macaroni and cheese or why they are rewatching a sitcom they've seen 50 times, they will almost always point to the last 2.
They overwhelmingly endorse the expectation that they consume comfort items because it is pleasurable, rewarding, and generates positive feelings.
They perceive their behavior entirely as a pursuit of positive reinforcement. They think, I am treating myself.
However, when researchers look past self-reporting and apply rigorous regression models to analyze the actual frequency of comfort consumption against these stated expectations, a stark contradiction emerges.
The expectation of pleasure and reward has a surprisingly weak association with how often a person actually consumes a comfort item. Wait, so if we actually look at the hard data of their behavior, pleasure isn't the driving force.
The actual frequency of comfort consumption is driven almost entirely by the need to manage negative affect, alleviate boredom, and enhance cognitive competence.
That is a massive disconnect. People genuinely believe they are treating themselves or actively seeking joy, but in reality, they're medicating distress.
They are utilizing the comfort item to neutralize negative emotions, to combat the low arousal, highly uncomfortable state of boredom, or to provide a temporary psychological reset to handle severe cognitive fatigue.
The behavior is fundamentally evasive rather than additive. It's about removing a negative, not adding a positive.
This data reveals a widespread cultural tendency to mislabel our comfort favorites as guilty pleasure. Right. The term guilty pleasure implies an indulgence, a surplus of enjoyment that violates some standard of high taste. It suggests you're having too much fun with something frivolous.
Exactly. But based on what we're discussing, these media choices act much more like a cognitive painkiller. We don't call Tylenol a guilty pleasure. Just as someone might eat a bowl of chicken soup to physically blunt the cognitive tax of loneliness, Julian watches Mean Girls to anesthetize the intense mental fatigue of sustaining his high-pressure intellectual persona.
The comfort media requires absolutely zero performance. It demands nothing of him. It offers immediate, predictable emotional stabilization. It is medicine, not indulgence.
Which perfectly establishes the baseline. We use the comfort favorite privately to heal, but moving beyond the private regulation of the mind, we must examine the public performance of taste. How do we behave when we step out of the living room and back into the dinner party?
And this brings us to the second pillar of media consumption, the social favorite. To analyze this, we have to look at how media choices are actively weaponized to construct the ideal self within highly competitive social environments.
To really grasp this, consider the story of a young creative director in Seoul named Min Jun. Min Jun occupies a world where taste is not just a preference, it's a literal form of currency. If you walk into Min Jun's apartment, it doesn't look like a place where someone simply lives. It looks like a meticulously curated gallery of his social favorites. The shelving units are custom-built to display obscure 1970s European jazz vinyl. He maintains an immense, organized digital library of avant-garde cinema that he effortlessly references and dissects at industry networking events.
He understands implicitly that in his social circle among designers, artists, and directors expressing an affinity for the correct, challenging artistic works is absolutely essential for maintaining a status.
Yet the reality of Min Jun's relationship with this media is far more complex than pure appreciation.
Privately, he admits to close friends that he often finds these highly demanding atonal jazz records and plotless avant-garde films absolutely exhausting to engage with.
I mean, after a 12-hour workday, the last thing his brain actually wants to process is a challenging piece of experimental art.
Right. But he performs his passion for these classics anyway. He buys the records, he attends the screenings, he memorizes the critiques.
He does this to signal his sophistication to his peers, while his true, unpolished joys, maybe a catchy pop song or a predictable reality show, remain completely hidden. He functions as a prisoner of his own curated identity, utilizing his stated favorites as a shield to prove definitively that he belongs among the elite.
Min Jun's exhausting performance is a direct manifestation of sociological frameworks established by the French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu. Bourdieu analyzed the cultural field in a way that revolutionized how we understand taste. He argued that the realm of arts and culture is not a neutral, democratic space of pure aesthetic appreciation.
It's not just everyone likes what they like.
Exactly. Rather, it is a force field defined by constant, permanent relationships of inequality. Within this field, individuals are constantly struggling, whether they realize it or not, to accumulate and monopolize different types of capital to secure or elevate their social position.
And when we say capital here, we aren't just talking about money in a bank account, right?
Correct. Economic capital is only one piece of the puzzle. The central concept here is cultural capital.
Cultural capital.
Yes. Cultural capital refers to the non-financial social assets that promote social mobility beyond mere economic means. It encompasses your education, your intellect, your style of speech, your manner of dress, and crucially, your aesthetic taste.
And this cultural capital forms a rigid, invisible boundary that separates individuals from different classes.
Yes. The acquisition of this capital is deeply tied to one's class background and the education system, which condition individuals from birth to approach art in specific, highly class-stratified ways.
How does that conditioning actually manifest when someone looks at a painting or watches a film?
Bourdieu identified two primary opposing modes of acquiring and appreciating art. The dominant classes, who are typically conditioned by higher education and economic security, develop what he called a distanced or intellectual appreciation of culture. This approach deliberately ignores the immediate emotional impact of the work. Instead, it focuses on form, style, historical context, and the relationship of the work to other pieces of art. It is a highly reflexive, analytical, and detached posture.
So it's not about whether a movie made you cry, it's about how the director utilized framing to subvert mid-century cinematic tropes.
Exactly. In stark contrast, the subjugated classes, who often lack the same extensive educational conditioning and economic safety nets, tend to approach art seeking immediate gratification. They look for sensory pleasure, strong emotional resonance, and relatable representations of the familiar world. They want the movie to be exciting or funny or moving.
Which brings us back to Minjin. By hoarding all that obscure vinyl and championing avant-garde cinema, he is actively utilizing the symbolic self-completion strategy we discussed earlier in the psychological model. Those jazz records are not merely music to him. They are, in Bourdieu's terms, objectified cultural capital. By accumulating and prominently displaying these specific difficult objects, he is signaling symbolic mastery over the intellectual codes required to understand them.
This performance masks any internal discrepancy or imposter syndrome he might feel about his true status within the highly competitive, cutthroat creative industry in Seoul.
The physical objects serve as tangible, undeniable proof of his aesthetic legitimacy. If he owns the record, he must possess the intellect required to appreciate it.
But there is a twist here, isn't there? Because if you look at modern elites today, they don't just listen to classical music and watch silent film.
Right. The rules of what constitutes cultural capital have changed since Bourdieu was writing in the 1970s.
They have evolved significantly. The strict, impermeable boundary between high culture and low culture has shifted, giving rise to a phenomenon sociologists call the cultural omnivore.
The cultural omnivore.
The modern elite no longer restrict themselves exclusively to obscure, highbrow art to signal their status. Doing so today might actually appear rigid or out of touch. Instead, the cultural omnivore consumes broadly across all cultural levels. They consume the avant-garde, but they also enthusiastically consume highly popular mainstream media.
So how does an elite signal their status if they're watching the exact same reality show as everyone else? If the media itself isn't the boundary, what is?
The defining characteristic of the cultural omnivore is not what they consume, but how they consume it. They aestheticize the popular. They do not watch a mainstream reality television show or a low-budget action movie with the naive immediate gratification that Bourdieu observed in the lower classes.
You watch it ironically or analytically.
Exactly. They apply the distanced intellectual framework of high culture to low culture artifacts. They might dissect the editing choices of a reality dating show to make a profound point about late-stage capitalism or modern performative romance.
So this ability to effortlessly navigate, synthesize, and critique both a 7-hour Hungarian art film and a trashy reality show demonstrates an even more expansive and dominant form of cultural mastery.
It shows they are above the media, acting as a sociological observer rather than a mere consumer.
This complex navigation of taste boundaries isn't just happening in a vacuum, though. It is heavily enforced and amplified by the modern digital platforms we use every day.
Absolutely.
The very architecture of our streaming services fundamentally reshapes how cultural capital is signaled, accumulated, and protected. We can observe a clear structural distinction between platforms that represent different spheres of cultural production.
The distinction between a platform like MUBI and a platform like Netflix perfectly illustrates this digital stratification. MUBI operates strictly within what Bourdieu would call the field of small-scale production. It focuses entirely on art house cinema, international festival films, and avant-garde works.
And its value proposition to the consumer is derived entirely from symbolic capital and prestige. It caters to a specific audience that demands highly curated, intellectually demanding content.
And then you have Netflix, which operates primarily within the field of large-scale production. It is driven by massive economic capital and mass appeal, offering a vast, almost infinite repository of popular, easily accessible content designed for maximum retention.
What is crucial to understand here is that the algorithmic recommendation systems powering these platforms do not erode existing social and cultural divisions, like early internet techno-optimists predicted.
No, they actively reinforce them. Algorithmic mediation fragments individual cultural tastes into highly specific sociocultural patterns. A platform learns the class-based viewing practices of the user, whether they prefer distanced appreciation or immediate gratification, and continuously serves content that aligns with and hardens those categorical boundaries.
Yet even when a massive platform like Netflix steps out of its lane and into the territory of high art, when they spend millions funding and producing prestige, black and white art films like Alfonso Cuarón's Roma, or a massive auteur project like Martin Scorsese's The Irishman, it doesn't necessarily democratize taste.
Right. It doesn't suddenly turn everyone into an art house aficionado.
No. Instead, it perfectly serves the specific, complex desires of the cultural omnivore.
It allows the modern elite user to effortlessly toggle between high-art prestige cinema and mass-market, lowbrow reality television within the exact same seamless digital interface. The platform accommodates the elite desire to consume omnivorously while simultaneously maintaining the underlying algorithmic patterns that separate them from other user demographics.
You know, it's so tempting to look at Min Jun's highly curated performance of taste, his specific vinyl collection, his ironic enjoyment of pop culture, and dismiss it all as inherently inauthentic. It's easy to call it pure elitism or snobbery.
It is easy, but it's not entirely accurate.
Right. Looking at this through Bourdieu's framework, it feels less like vanity and more like structural necessity. You wouldn't call a professional basketball player fake for dribbling the ball instead of running with it. They're simply adapting to the specific rules of the sport they're playing.
That is a highly accurate parallel. In Min Jun's specific cultural field, displaying the correct nuanced taste is the literal mechanism for career advancement, networking, and social survival.
So, weaponizing aesthetics isn't a symptom of mere vanity. It is an adaptation to a modern meritocratic system that demands the constant projection of cultural mastery.
In a world where even our leisure time is relentlessly scrutinized for its social and professional value, Min Jun is just playing the game according to the rules of the force field he inhabits. His taste is his uniform.
Which brings us to the final and most profound category of media consumption, the sacred favorite. If the comfort favorite regulates the mind and body, and the social favorite validates and protects the ego in society, the sacred favorite serves a fundamentally different psychological and spiritual function entirely.
To really understand what makes a favorite sacred, consider the story of Elena.
Elena is an elderly woman living in a quiet, sunlit neighborhood in Buenos Aires. In her home, among shelves of books and family photographs, she keeps a specific, slightly scratched vinyl record of a cello concerto.
She has owned this precise record for nearly half a century. This is her sacred favorite.
But her relationship with this piece of media is entirely unique. She enforces a strict, unbreakable rule upon herself. She only allows herself to listen to it exactly once a year on the precise anniversary of a day that changed the trajectory of her life forever.
For Elena, the music is an aesthetic experience so dense, so overwhelmingly tied to her personal history and deepest emotional core, that to listen to it casually while washing dishes or reading a book or having guests over would be a literal desecration.
The music isn't just a collection of pleasant sounds. It functions as a bridge to a profound foundational memory. It is a vessel for an emotion so immense that she can only afford to feel it in small, heavily ritualized doses. If she played it every Tuesday, it would shatter her.
Elena's relationship with this piece of music perfectly encapsulates the concept of the trans-aesthetic experience, a profound framework developed by the philosopher Conrad Ott.
A trans-aesthetic experience.
A trans-aesthetic experience is a reaction to an artwork that completely transcends mere sensory pleasure or intellectual appreciation. It is not about whether the music sounds good or whether the cellist's technique is flawless.
It bypasses all of that.
It is characterized by an intense sense of sublimity, ineffability, and mysticism. The encounter with the artwork moves far beyond the visual or auditory aesthetics and triggers a profound existential or spiritual resonance within the subject.
To truly grasp the mechanics of the sacred favorite, it is incredibly useful to look at the aesthetic principles of Eastern Orthodox Christianity.
Yes, specifically the creation and veneration of iconography.
Right. In the Orthodox tradition, The aesthetic beauty of an icon, how realistically the face is painted, how vibrant the colors are, is completely secondary to its ontological truth. An icon is considered a theanthropic creation.
A theanthropic creation implies a literal fusion of human artistic creativity and divine inspiration. Because the icon is meant to be an actual window to the divine, the artist cannot simply sit down and paint a pleasing, imaginative image.
The process is radically different from secular art.
The creation process requires the artist to undergo intense, prolonged periods of fasting and prayer before they even touch a brush.
And the physical materials they use, the strict geometric proportions of the figures, the specific application of light and shadow, all of these elements are strictly codified.
But they aren't codified for visual appeal. They are structured to ensure the theological and spiritual accuracy of the image.
The artist's personal ego, their desire to show off their technique, is entirely removed from the process. This is exactly why traditional icons are unsigned. The artwork is not an object of aesthetic contemplation. It is a sacred medium.
We can map the psychological model of religious art perception directly onto Elena's secular experience with her sacred favorite. This model identifies 6 distinct dimensions of subjective experience that occur when an individual encounters profoundly meaningful art.
Let's walk through what actually happens in the mind during those moments.
The first dimension is the emotional dimension. This encompasses the immediate, deep feelings of sorrow, peace, awe, or reverence that the art evokes.
Okay.
The second is the visual aesthetic, or in Elena's case, the auditory dimension. This pertains to the actual sensory intake of the media, the specific timbre of the cello, the crackle of the scratched vinyl.
The third is the cognitive dimension. And this isn't the distanced analytical cognition of the social favorite, is it?
No. This involves deep internal reflection on the meaning, the personal history, and the memories permanently attached to those specific sounds.
The fourth dimension is communicative. In a trans-aesthetic experience, the art acts as a direct, almost living channel of communication, conveying specific meaning or memory between the artwork and the observer, or bridging a connection to a lost loved one.
The fifth is the spiritual transformative dimension. This is the crux of the experience, where the individual undergoes a profound internal shift, a moment of deep introspection that fundamentally alters their immediate state of being.
Finally, the sociocultural dimension anchors the entire experience in a specific, immovable, historical, or personal context.
When Elena sits in her living room once a year and drops the needle on that record, she enters distinct states of cognitive processing known in psychology as absorption and flow.
Absorption is the profound capacity to fully immerse oneself in the artwork, blocking out all external distractions, anxieties, and environmental noise.
And flow is a state of intense, sustained focus where the perception of passing time and physical space becomes entirely irrelevant.
Her yearly rigid ritual triggers this exact state of flow, allowing all 6 dimensions we just discussed to synthesize into a singular, transcendent internal shift.
Because the trans-aesthetic experience is so incredibly powerful and psychologically overwhelming, humans instinctively ritualize their engagement with the sacred to protect it from degradation.
Look again at Orthodox worship. Believers do not simply walk casually into a church. They perform highly specific, codified physical gestures, bowing in specific moments, kissing the doorway or the icon, lighting pure beeswax candles.
And the environment itself is heavily engineered to separate it from the mundane world. It is deeply multisensory, involving the thick scent of incense, the hypnotic sound of specific liturgical chanting, and the flickering reflection of candlelight on gold surfaces.
These rituals create a thick, undeniable boundary between the chaotic, mundane world outside and the sacred space inside.
Elena has constructed identical, albeit entirely personal, boundaries around her cello record. By restricting her consumption to one specific day a year, she's performing a vital ritual of preservation.
She is actively ensuring that the psychological impact of the music remains undiluted by mundane repetition.
Which is so crucial to understand.
If she were to digitize that record, put it in her phone, and add it to a daily Spotify playlist she listens to while commuting or grocery shopping, the repeated casual exposure would completely strip the music of its trans-aesthetic power.
It would inevitably reduce that profound emotional bridge to mere auditory stimuli.
This highlights the stark, unbridgeable contrast between the individual who holds the art as sacred and a casual observer. Imagine a non-believer or simply a friendly guest in Elena's home who happens to hear the exact same cello concerto playing.
Their ears would process the identical auditory stimuli. The sound waves hitting their eardrums are exactly the same.
But without the deep psychological anchoring, without the decades of personal history, and without the ritualized context, they would perceive the music merely as a pleasant aesthetic object or an interesting historical artifact.
They would entirely miss the transcendent reality that the music constructs for Elena in that moment.
This raises a critical and somewhat alarming tension regarding the architecture of modern media consumption. We exist in a technological landscape defined by infinite, frictionless accessibility.
Digital streaming platforms provide immediate, unearned access to almost the entire recorded history of human music, cinema, and art.
Which brings up a massive question. Does this frictionless availability inherently dilute the aura of sacred favorites? If you can summon the most emotionally devastating piece of music in history with a casual voice command while brushing your teeth, can anything truly remain sacred?
Sociological theories regarding subcultural capital, particularly those developed by media scholar Matt Hills, suggest a different, more adaptive outcome.
What does he argue?
Hills argues that new media and infinite accessibility do not necessarily destroy the sacred, but they do force a behavioral evolution. Technological shifts force individuals to invent entirely new modes of distinction and new forms of ritual.
So when the friction of scarcity is removed, when you no longer have to hunt down a rare vinyl record or travel to a specific theater, we don't just give up on the sacred. We have to construct artificial boundaries to protect the media that holds trans-aesthetic value for us.
The ritual shifts from the physical difficulty of acquiring the object to the strict, self-imposed internal rules governing exactly how, where, and when the digital media is consumed.
The architecture of our media consumption is, ultimately, a direct, undeniable map of our internal psychological framework.
Julian's YouTube history is a physical manifestation of the exhausted mind seeking regulation, utilizing the comfort favorite to numb the acute biological pain of self-discrepancy.
Minjun's curated vinyl collection represents the anxious ego seeking validation, deploying the social favorite to accumulate cultural capital and secure his precarious position within a competitive sociological field.
And Elena's scratched cello concerto is the soul-seeking transcendence, fiercely protecting the sacred favorite to maintain a vital bridge to profound foundational memory.
The overwhelming tension of modern life is that we are constantly, relentlessly pressured by digital architectures and social expectations to blur these highly distinct necessary boundaries. We are constantly encouraged by algorithms to consume what is sacred to us as mere background noise to maximize our daily productivity. Or, conversely, we are pressured to falsely elevate our private, low-stakes comfort objects into profound social statements just to satisfy the endless demands of online curation and content creation. The tragedy here is not that we possess multiple conflicting identities that require very different tools for navigation. The tragedy is that in attempting to seamlessly merge these distinct psychological needs for the sheer convenience of the algorithm, we risk losing the profound, terrifying clarity of the sacred entirely.